Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for joining us for our third workshop of the Neoliberal Heritagescapes series. This workshop series is a part of the Stanford Global Studies Research Workshop Program, and Chandana and I are graduate student coordinators for it. And we're extremely delighted and honored to be able to have amongst our midst Chiara. Chiara, thank you so much for being here, and your work is so influential and important, not just within the spaces of archaeology and anthropology, but also larger political conversations that are much needed in the world, and some of which we'll be having today as a part of the session. Chiara Cesari is an associate professor in European Studies and Cultural Studies at the University of Amsterdam, having received a BA and MA from the Free University of Berlin and a PhD in socio-cultural anthropology from Stanford University. She has held research and teaching positions at the universities of Cambridge and Utrecht, among others. Her wide-ranging research explores how forms of memory, heritage, art, and cultural politics are shifting under conditions of contemporary globalization and state transformation. One strand of work explores how artists and activists are reclaiming and reinventing cultural institutions. Chiara is currently leading a major NWO-funded WIDI project on this theme named Imagining Institutions Otherwise. Another concerns the transnational politics of memory and cultural heritage, above all in the West Bank. Her monograph, Heritage and Cultural Struggle for Palestine, published in 2019, argues that Palestinian civil society has enrolled museums and urban regeneration initiatives to assert its distinct cultural heritage and the enduring Israeli occupation. Still another focuses on colonial legacies in contemporary Europe. Chiara is currently co-writing another monograph provisionally titled Curating the Colonial, which explores how museums are reframing colonial histories in response to post-colonial critiques. So as you can see, her work is extremely diverse, extremely contemporary, but has relevance across disciplines as well as subject matters and political events across the world. She will be in conversation with Chandana Waheed, who is a third-year PhD candidate at the Department of Anthropology at Stanford University, whose work also looks at questions of heritage, especially with respect to minority religious buildings in Pakistan, focusing on the city of Rawalpindi. So with that, I will pass on the mic to both of you. And thank you once again for being here, and looking forward to a fantastic conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shubhangi, and thank you so much, Chiara, for joining us today once again. We're very excited to have your Stanford alum, so all the faculty was also very excited to have you, virtually have you at Stanford again. As should be mentioned, we will be talking about Chiara's monograph, also her recent work and papers on creative institutionalism. I would start with my first question, unless Chiara wants to give a little bit of background of her book first. How do you want to go about it?
Yeah, maybe I can, if you want, I can say something a little bit about the genesis of the book and how I came to practice and to conceptualize heritage in Palestine, because it is a topic that has been with me for quite a long time. It was my dissertation at Stanford, but it took me quite a long time to turn it into a book. And indeed, I think I would have, at one point when I was about to finish the book, I really had a moment of crisis, and I thought I actually should rewrite it again. So because it's really a topic that has been with me for so long. And I have, in this time period, I would say, sort of my look at the question and my approach toward the question of heritage in Palestine has also has radically changed, I would say, in the sense that when I arrived in Palestine, I was coming to Palestine from experience, after having worked in various neighboring countries, particularly Syria, in museum and archaeology and heritage preservation. And I was quite unhappy, and I didn't like what I was involved in also because it was very much of, particularly in Syria, that was, of course, a dictatorship at the time as it is today, and a brutal one. And so, and the heritage that was being allowed in a place like Syria was very much of a state project in alliance with, I would say, post-Orientalist archaeologists. So I was coming with like a profound sense of disaffection from and discontent and anger also at myself, because I had been part of those projects that were cooperation between the Syrian Ministry of Culture and Antiquities and various European universities where I'd studied. And I went to Palestine for to work with an organization in particular. And then when I arrived in Palestine, I really discovered a different kind of heritage, which was, first of all, done by Palestinian NGOs. So quite unlike what I was used to, which was, again, I was used to deal with the people of the Ministry of, of Antiquities or Culture of the Syrian state or the Jordanian state, and with, again, international mission mostly, or I had worked for these museums, which was had been set up in the resort, and that was later destroyed by ISIS. And that was a project between the German state and some institute, like the Berlin universities, and again, the Syrian ministry. So coming from that and arriving in Palestine, and all of a sudden, being sort of in the position to work with a lot of really amazing NGOs, Palestinian NGOs, with a very, I thought, interesting and creative, generative understanding of heritage. And that I'll say something about that. So I really, I decided to write my PhD about it. I first wanted to do something about the politics of heritage and memory in Syria, but again, I didn't want to work with the Syrian regime. So I just I fell in love with Palestine and also with the kind of work that was being done there, because it was really something completely new for me at the same time. And so when I started, I thought that I was going to write a PhD and a book about sort of heritage done by NGOs, a counter heritage, and also pretty much in a context of conflict. So the topic was, on the one hand, heritage and NGOs, and on the other hand, heritage and conflict, and how heritage is being mobilized within a context, a conflict context. Over the years, I kind of turned my my approach quite radically, because I really I wrote, I think, something, I tell a little bit about it in the introduction, because I really changed my approach and towards the topic heritage in Palestine, because at one point I really realized that even if in a very sort of creative and according to logics, quite unlike what I had, the logic of the state, the Palestinian NGOs that I were working with were kind of working in lieu of the state and were carrying out some form of state function. So my whole distinction, state and civil society, got completely disrupted, even though Palestinian organization had and still have a very strong civil society sense of themselves as members of civil society, active members of civil society, and as people who oppose, in particular, of course, not only the Israeli occupation and Israeli colonization, but also the particular kind of state that the Palestinian Authority is and represent. And the other thing that I really, in a way, I got less interested in the conflict itself and heritage as a sort of, as a weapon, and way more interested in the sort of, again, creative, generative particularly from an institutional point of view, qualities of the kind of work that I was participating in and writing about. So in the end, this is why when I remember the editor of Stanford University Press asked me what kind of, I would like to have on the cover of the book. And then I thought, I don't want the classic picture, that you have on some Palestinian book, which refer to the occupation and to violence, but I really tried to find an image that conveyed for me the imaginative, future-oriented, visionary quality of that kind of heritage work. And this is why on the cover, and I thank you, Shandana, for putting it on the flyer for this event. You put the cover of the book, which is actually is a drawing by a Palestinian artist who drawn around, I think it was in 2003, while swimming on the Jaffa, of the Jaffa coast, and Hassan Urani. And he is an artist. His family was originally from Hebron, which is the city I worked a lot on. And in that drawing, he was painting himself biking over the sky in Hebron, overlooking the old city of Hebron, but at the same time, sort of a future with a very broad horizon. And he painted a series of drawings. He has a series of drawings of himself on a bike, flying over all kinds of global cities, New York, because he studied there. And then I don't remember other cities I remember now his image of him on the bike flying over the Brooklyn Bridge in New York, but he has also other cities. So I really like this idea of heritage as a kind of sort of fertile terrain, generative ground for thinking about the future in imaginative, creative, and hopeful way. So that's sort of how I would like to frame it, and the ways in which the book developed. And indeed, that project is very much the grounding of my current main research project, which is about creative institutionalism and deals with heritage, but a lot with contemporary art as well. And that was very much inspired by the kind of creative institutionalism produced by Palestinian organizations.
Right, just to again appreciate the book cover, but also I think when I was reading the book, that was very interesting, that the difference and the departure from the typical actors that people state when they talk about heritage, and the way you talk about state and state formation is very different than what we deal with even in India and Pakistan, where Shubi and I work, or generally when heritage framework is analyzed. But also, I also fell in love with the book cover. And this, what I took away from it was also sort of like this futuristic, this very powerful flight away from what's below or behind. It was a very powerful message. And I think the book is also very, very hopeful in terms of what heritage can provide to the state and people in a conflict zone like Palestine. So I will move on to my first question, which is about the conflict. I would like to ask how ongoing conflict made heritage a useful tool for resistance, development, and participation in the context of Palestinian rehabilitation projects, and what role these projects play in the formation of collective memory and in supporting the Palestinian claims of historicity against the Palestinian dispossession of their past and the land.
Yeah, when I was thinking about my answer to your question, I thought about structuring it around two main issues. On the one hand, the question which go well beyond Palestine. Well, one point is about it's about Palestine, and it's about sort of the particular genealogy of Palestinian heritage, because the kind of heritage practices that are the subjects of the book do have a very, very long and layered history. And I think that particular history was very important in shaping the kind of heritage that we have today. And I think this is also a little bit of a problem with some of the heritage studies that are being done today, particularly in a place like Europe these days, which tend to be relatively to be devoid of a historical component. And I think really my own explorations of Palestinian heritage really taught me how important it is to understand heritage practices in a long historical perspective, because I really thought it was kind of also the sort of, if you don't look into the history of heritage practices, then you tend to flatten them, and very often to read them as a sort of local, either the vernacularization of global practices and global trends, or people have talked about vernacularization, or talked about dubbing of local heritage practices building on international and particularly, world heritage discourses. And yet what I really discovered while in my investigation of Palestinian heritage is really how, the particular relevance of the various heritage currents that had developed throughout Palestinian history. And in particular, on the one end, the really very important relationship of Palestinian heritage practices, heritage organizing with the liberation movement. This is very strongly so, particularly from the 70s onwards, but also with previous formation of knowledge production, such as Orientalist knowledge in the 20s and 30s, by Palestinians. So I thought, I don't know much about Ottoman history, so unfortunately I didn't really dug deep into that, but really I think I can safely argue that the kind of heritage that we see today has its roots in the specific Palestinian/native Orientalism of the 20s and 30s that also developed in conversation with and within Orientalist circles, colonial Orientalist circle, but at the same time with the nascent national liberation movement. And then in the 70s and 80s, really the relationship with, on the one hand, the national liberation movement, the PLO, and the struggle in the Palestinian occupied territory, but also with the women's movement and the particular kind of women's organizing in Palestine. Those were very relevant to understand the particular kind of heritage that was being developed in Palestine. And also some currents of Arab thoughts around the question of Arab Renaissance, the specific place of Arab Turath, which is heritage in in Arab modernity, the place that it has and the place that it should have. Because there is a powerful normative discussion within Arab thought around the question of heritage in modernity. So I really thought one has to understand this complex history, which is both rooted and yet profoundly interconnected with global developments that are, and that's also very important, not often not centered in the West. And of course, the other point that is very relevant to take into consideration here is the question of, which goes beyond Palestine, is the relationship or like the place of heritage in settler colonial context, because this is also very, very, very relevant. There is I built here on the one hand the work of Patrick Wolf on settler colonialism and a little bit of Fanon as well. And this idea is that there is I think I have in the book a quote by Fanon. I cannot quote it by heart, but Fanon says something like, the colonizer is not content with destroying the present of the colonized, but it profoundly attacks the past of the colonizer. And this is particularly so, this is Patrick Wolf, in the case of settler colonialism, because the point of settler colonialism is also to cut sort of the natives' roots in the land. And in a sense, producing heritage is about retracing, reconnecting with the land, reconnecting with history. So it's both, in a way, it's also is the basic and the basis of resistance, of any form of resistance, in the sense is the only guarantee of cultural survival. So, and I think this is really very, 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 very important. And at the same time, again, heritage, I would say, in Palestine is not at all a conservative project. I mean, some Palestinian ethnographers and heritage and folklorists and heritage people in the 70s have been criticized for having a kind of an essentialist view of Palestinian culture and Palestinian heritage. And yet, I think, first of all, they were mobilizing in the sense of the old Spivakian sense of strategic essentialism, culture, in order to, to provide for some sort of group continuity and integrity. But it was also particularly creative, and this already in the 80s, 70s and 80s, and even more so today, when very often sort of heritage organizations work together with cultural organizations, artist organizations, and it's very hard to sort of draw a line between, okay, this is a cultural organization, this is a heritage organization, this is an art organization. In fact, sort of all these domains intersect. Okay, it's a very complex, I mean, I think you asked me a very complex questions. I try to articulate an answer at around sort of the two keywords that I wanted to examine a little closer. I hope my answer is somehow, gives you somehow a sense of a sort of a coherent, provides for a coherent answer to your question.
Of course, definitely. I can also relate it to how you have situated it in your introduction of the book, moving on from starting from political movements and the ways of resistance to situating into the theoretical framework of settler colonialism, and you quoted Fanon, almost the same as you quoted it in the book. I would like to work a little bit more with the idea of what kind of heritage, but here I think we should focus on the heritage projects in the city of Hebron that you extensively talk about, and how the conceptualization and mobilization of heritage by the state and NGOs can be seen to have different aims and goals, and what this difference enables in the process of urban recovery and socio-material reconstruction of Palestinian historic landscape. And I'm thinking here with the idea and the tensions of between heritage and counter-heritage that you talk about. Also the different focuses on, PA's focus on ancient archaeology and NGO's focus on contemporary past.
Yeah, this is something that is something that I wasn't expecting to find out, to encounter, and in fact it was a very, very, very important dimension of my fieldwork. So when I was in my interactions with and my work for various Palestinian heritage organizations, actually one of the what was always in the background was this conflict with the Palestinian Department of Antiquities. And sort of one could think that the Palestinian Department of Antiquities and Cultural Heritage of the Palestinian Authority would also build and work towards a kind of counter heritage in the struggle against the occupation and particularly, the colonization of the Palestinian landscape. And the rhetoric of the Department of the Palestinian Authority was one of counter-heritage. At the same time, in fact, the kind of heritage politics they were enacting was a different one. And and they were clashing a lot with the NGOs. Now, my interpretation of this has to do, on the one hand, with the structural weakness of the Palestinian Authority as a quasi or actually non-state, but also with the particular genealogies of this institution, because essentially when the Oslo Accords created the Palestinian Authority, which was meant to, at least for Palestinian, to constitute the beginning of a Palestinian state, and was created by the Oslo Accords to provide some form of Palestinian autonomous governance and administrations in the area from which the Israeli military had withdrawn. Then again, Palestinians hoped and expected the Palestinian Authority to become a state, an independent Palestinian state, but because of the failure of the negotiations and the explosion of the Second Intifada and politicized the reinvasion of the Palestinian cities by Sharon in the, 2003, 2004, then in a way, the Palestinian Authority got stuck. It remained a kind of quasi-state, even though at one point, I think it was around 10 years ago, it decided to call itself the State of Palestine. But in fact, is a kind of self-governing administration that was supposed to develop into a state, but got stuck in the middle because the state was never declared and never came. And in fact, is profoundly, now I don't want to go into a discussion of the Palestinian Authority. It's a very complex terrain. For many Palestinians and many pundits, essentially, it has transformed into an sort of the watchdog of the Israeli occupation, because it's kind of administering the Palestinian areas for the Israeli military administrations. Anyway, a lot of Palestinians have criticized it a bit. It has also divided into two, Gaza with Hamas and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. But essentially is a non-sovereign governing entity, which has now pretty much lost not only a lot of funding from the West that used to be a major support for the Palestinian Authority, but also a lot of legitimacy among Palestinians. So it's again, it's a the terms abound: non-state, quasi-state, and non-sovereign quasi-state, and so on and so forth. But essentially, it has never been able to kind of work with a measure of sovereignty and legitimacy. I would argue that could make it work. And of course, the problem was also that the Oslo Accord didn't produce the end of the occupation and the end of colonization. So in a way, to have a state or an under occupation is a contradiction in term. But anyway, not only the heritage infrastructure of the Palestinian Authority was non-sovereign from the beginning and profoundly weak. The question is that that's my own argument, my own interpretation, that it's profoundly shaped by its colonial genealogy, because it was built on the model of the British Department of Antiquities that existed until 67 in Jerusalem. That was part of the Jordanian administration. And even for a long time, from the Oslo Accords in 1993 until very recently, I think it was 2018, the department mandate was governed by a law which was the old British law of antiquities. So, for example, the heritage notion, or the kind of heritage that the department was being mandated to protect under the terms of this colonial law, was essentially only archaeology and nothing after 1700 AD. So nothing after the 18th century. So there was, for example, heritage was the vernacular historic heritage was a non-category, and the department did something with it, but in fact, it was not even mandated to do it. So in this context of, if you wish, non-existing state, the Palestinian organizations and the NGOs started to pop up, to emerge and proliferate, because also there was this amazing historic vernacular built heritage of the particularly the call it traditional fabric of Palestinian villages and towns. This was again not protected by the Department of Antiquities, and organizations started to work a lot with this heritage, also because it was deeply threatened not only by the occupation, but also by the rapid urbanization that was taking place in the Palestinian towns and villages after Oslo. So you have all these organizations that emerged from the first one was in 1991, RIWAC, which is, if you wish, I call it the Palestinian quasi shadow Ministry of Culture and Cultural Heritage. But after that, many sort of sprang up and started working in the various cities. And the one that I've worked the most closely with is that I've studied is the Hebron Rehabilitation Committee that has been working since, I think, 1996 in the old city of Hebron to restore the decaying old city of Hebron, an amazing old town, now on the World Heritage List, that was threatened by a group of fundamentalist, extremely ideological settlers who believe that the center of Hebron with the tomb of the patriarch is their own heritage and therefore is their own land, and who have been occupying a series of spots in the old town, also making use of the abandoned village, of the abandoned buildings. So the Hebron Rehabilitation Committee started restoring and repopulating those houses because they were falling apart, but also because, falling apart, they were much easier prey to the occupation of the settlers and the expropriation by the settlers.
Right. So moving on to the recent paper you've written on creative institutionalism, can you reflect a little bit on how cultural management operates through precarious interconnected networks of associations in Palestine, probably reflecting more on Kalandia International as an example of such alliances, and Kalandia as a site of extended temporality, symbolically pointing towards both Palestinians' deep, indeed ancestral roots in the landscape and a potential future of self-determination?
It's basically what happened in Palestine is that in the 90s and early 2000s, you have these various heritage and other cultural organizations emerging and taking care, if you wish, of the patrimony, the heritage, and the cultural resources that the state was not able to take care and to care for. And at one point, what happened, there was some sort of specialization. There was one organization, for example, doing certain kind of things, another one working in one city, the other one working in the other city. And at one point, when those organizations started in the 2000, in the course of the 2000, and that sort of accelerated in the 2010, started also aligning with each other and creating partnerships that arguably constitute a form of experimental, flexible, precarious infrastructure of cultural management in a context, again, where the state is not there. And I think Kalandia is a very, I can make the example of Kalandia and the Palestinian, the RIWAC biennial, because it's kind of, I think it's really a very good example of the process that I'm trying to tackle here. So you had RIWAC, which is the major Palestinian heritage organization, NGO, taking care of the historic vernacular heritage. It was the first organization in 1991. It was created even before the Palestinian Authority to restore the historic fabrics of Palestinian and vernacular architecture of the Ottoman, well, also, I mean, some Mamluk and Ottoman period and later that was being destroyed And then at one point they had an artist collaborating with them. They've always adopted a very interdisciplinary way of working. So they had a lot of architects, of course, doing, you know, architectural restoration, but they had archaeologists also. And they, at one point, they started working with this artist, Khalil Rabah, who is an artist. Right now, I'm writing quite a lot about him because I think his work is also particularly interesting in the sense of in terms of heritage. And they started working together, and together they developed this idea of the Palestinian Biennial of Art and Architecture, which was the Riwaq Biennial. And Riwaq used this biennial as a kind of platform to connect with global cultural flows, and made the Palestinian historic heritage and the Palestinian historic towns and villages as both the site of the biennial, but also as the kind of one of the major themes of the biennial. And the idea was to, again, sort of create cultural exchange and to mobilize sort of societal, artistic, and transnational forces to help support the project of urban revitalization in Palestine. And they were quite successful in many ways. They also launched a national project of heritage preservation within the context of the Palestinian Biennial in Venice, actually, partly in Venice and partly in Palestine, in the context of the 2009 Venice Biennial. So they basically did sort of Riwaq as a heritage organization, created the very first Palestinian Biennial. And at one point, though, they decided to start working with other organizations because they felt, we cannot do it on our own, and we should get together with other cultural and arts organizations to produce a Palestinian biennial, which is not only a meeting ground of the various organizations, but is also an emerging infrastructure, and one that is sort of collaborative, negotiated, and originally non-hierarchical. And so this is what I call, and then those organizations got together and they created the Kalandia International, which is now the Palestinian Biennial. The last one was in 2018 before the pandemic, of course. And it's kind of the National Palestinian Biennial, which is still organized by this alliance of cultural centers, NGOs, with always a strong heritage focus, also because of the role of Riwaq, but that kind of stand in for what in most other countries is usually an infrastructure set up by the state. And I find this, this particular kind of creative experimental institutionalism extremely generative and productive in terms of thinking about new forms of institutionalism elsewhere as well. And as an inspiration, as a place to learn from, to create better heritage and cultural institutions, as opposed to a place where, it's a place that is always, marked by lack, by war, by conflict. In fact, I think this is an example of really, future-oriented institutional work that we can learn from.
Right. Thank you so much. I think it clearly points towards the possibilities of reworking the meaning of state and cultural heritage, especially in the conflict context like Palestine, in which the long-term thinking and modern statehood is in some way absent. I think we should open for question and answer from the audience. And I think we already have a question from Jasmine, who is also a graduate student at Stanford.
Okay,
My internet's a little bit more stable, so I'm happy to read it out. So thank you so much for this conversation and just for the opportunity to reflect. I've been reading your work for a while, and it's just incredible to hear you talk more about some of the motivations behind it and also some of the receptions. And my question is actually about this reception of the collapsing. So you mentioned earlier in the conversation, this sort of collapsing of kind of contemporary art and heritage, or a way to sort of make them more intentionally sort of articulate. And I would love to hear about what the reception of that has been. Working in the heritage space, I feel, and working in the museum space, I feel like there's often this sort of disciplinary sort of separation or unwillingness to kind of think together with contemporary art and people who are theorizing about contemporary art. So I'd just love to hear about what the reception has been as you present this work and thinking about contemporary art and heritage in sort of the same breath.
Thank you for the question. I don't know if, I have to say I've never presented this kind of work in, now I'm gonna use very simplistic terms, but I've never presented this kind of work in a traditional heritage institution, I have to admit. And I have to say that recently I was visiting, because I was a visiting professor in Italy, where I'm now, and I was a visiting professor in this art historical institute in Florence, which was run by and populated by people studying Leonardo and this kind, Renaissance art, Leonardo and the sort of, it was Dutch Italian, so the Rembrandt and this kind of art. So, and at the beginning, when I started talking about my kind of work, I have to say I've encountered some I mean, people were very open, but at the same time, they were also, how can I say, a little disconcerted by the idea that this sort of heritage is not something that is almost sacred, this idea of heritage as a sacred religion, and especially this idea of heritage as sort of conservation of authenticity, as opposed to an idea of heritage as sort of, future-oriented, socio-cultural, political creativity and experimentation. But apart from that, I think it's, I mean, apart from this sort of very conservative places, I hope my former colleagues at the Institute don't listen to me at the moment. I don't see any of them here. But apart from this very conservative sort of bastion of traditional art history, I've always had very positive, very, very positive reception. And I have to say, in Palestine, in Palestine, like in other places, there is, among the general public, there is, I think there is a particular relation in, people tend to have a particular relation, I would say very contested relations towards the archaeological past. Because archaeology is in a place like Palestine, but also in a place like Syria, is often very sort of profoundly associated with colonial history and colonial and state power, because it has been mobilized as such for a long time. And therefore there is either a celebration of archaeology, a historical celebration of archaeology as the source of heritage, and that is sort of the foundations upon which society can be built, or a sense of distrust because there is this sort of immediate association of heritage with colonialism and bad nationalism and state oppression. If you think about, again, the use that people, Saddam Hussein, but also the Assad family made of the archaeological past. While historic heritage and other forms of heritage are much more part of I would say, yeah, part of local, well, local expressive culture is a very essentialist way of putting it, but there is a sort of a very strong, and the idea is that heritage is really very much part of our present as well. And it's a resource as opposed to, you know, something that we have to conserve and that blocks our lives. I hope I answered your question.
You did. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jasmine, and thank you, Chiara, for answering that. Just want to take this opportunity in case anybody would like to ask another question. You could raise your hand or drop in your question in the chat, either directly to myself or Shandana, or also for everybody to see. And maybe while everybody's thinking, I also had a question. It's more, I think it's more of a thought as I'm thinking through as both you and Chandana were speaking. So please feel free to comment on it as you see fit. And in particular, I was thinking about when you were talking how the nature of the Palestinian state, and in many ways the identities it's gone through in its own self-formulation, which is it's a non-state to a quasi-state to a non-sovereign state. And there's an interplay between how, of course, it's perceived in the international arena, how its specific membership in the UN space as an international global member, versus the internal dynamics, especially in the space of heritage practice that's happening, which is more an interplay between Palestinian citizens, residents, and this entity that calls itself a state. And also to Shandana's comment upon like just that long-term thinking regarding heritage practices, that we rely upon the state for so much is just not possible in this space, simply because of the I would say, I don't have the word for it, but the nature of the volatile nature of the statehood, as it were. So I guess like this just prompted me to really think about, and maybe if we can take this as an opportunity to think about that, can heritage preservation, since heritage as a practice is about producing narratives of value and which require legitimacy and authority in order to stick. So can heritage preservation or heritage production or even weaponizing of heritage, can it happen without a state body at all? Or rather not without having like a very coherent, stable idea of state? Can it actually happen within just the space of the different citizen-led private bodies which do not rely upon state or cannot rely upon state? Or rather the volatility or the conflictual nature of heritage instrumentalization relies upon a state versus a non-state or a private interaction? So I'm sorry, that's kind of like the thoughts I'm working with right now, and I guess it's more of a theoretical question, but was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I have been thinking a lot about the state, because one of my main focus is heritage, memory, and cultural politics, art. But also I have a long-standing interest in the state, and I think a lot of my work has been about connecting the two, sort of my interest in culture, heritage, and memory, and on the other hand, connecting with this interest in the sort of the very materiality of the state and how the state works. And I've been trying to. I've been writing an article that got published a couple of years ago about heritage and the state. That I'm not sure it's been very. I mean, I'm not convinced that I managed to solve the question. It was, of course, it was an impossible task, but I'm still not fully convinced of my argument in that article. But this is certainly an interest of mine. And but my reference to that article that I'm a little bit unhappy with is to say that I don't have a clear-cut answer to your question. Okay, this is my theory. I'm also, like you, very, very sort of concerned with the relationship between heritage and cultural production and the state, and particularly the ways in which the state is transforming today. And what I tried to do in that article was to compare Palestine with Italy. and I guess, I mean, probably Italy is a situation similar to, you both work in India, am I right? Or in India and Pakistan, isn't it? Is it?
I work in India. Shandana works in the context of Pakistan.
Yeah. So I would say those are massive states. So like the Italian states. So they are, and they are quite different from the Palestinian state. And this is why when I, long ago, I submitted a research proposal around those issues, and the committee, which was very, very traditional, I would say, I was very angry, but their argument for not giving me the research grant was because you cannot compare a sort of a state like Italy with a state or a non-state like Palestine. In fact, sort of the point that I thought there was a lot of Eurocentrism in that kind of reasoning, that, you know, how can you compare, you know, one of the sort of the whatever pinnacle, well, it's a collapsing pinnacle of the welfare state in Europe with the Palestinian state, which doesn't even exist. But again, this is still my sort of being irritated by their argumentation, which I thought was very flawed. But certainly, I mean, we have sort of, what I believe is that we both have very different kinds of states, but I do believe that we should sort of compare and think of them in relation with each other, also because I think that neoliberal reforms, neoliberal so-called reforms, have profoundly shaped and transformed the kind of welfare state and developmental states, the sort of the leviathans that we sort of used to have. Because when I think of, I know the case of the Italian state, which used to have a really a major department of culture and cultural heritage, which has been progressively dismantled in the last 20 years. So there have been, alongside paradoxically, a rhetoric emphasizing, you know, the neoliberal rhetoric of, you know, cultural resources to promote the economy, tourism, and you know, to solve all kinds of social ills. At the same time, the state was dismantling its infrastructure of cultural and heritage management through these neoliberal so-called reforms. And so in a way, you know, through my research, I realized, and throughout my research, I realized how of course, the infrastructure of cultural management in Italy was not the Palestinian one. At the same time that it had been so, how can I say, emptied out, it had been, literally dismantled, that in fact, you know, I felt there was a facade of functioning cultural infrastructure, which had been, in fact, again, rendered, unworkable, very fragile. And so I started thinking about also the kind of the Palestinian situation as comparable to extreme form of neoliberal dismantlement of the state, because also in Italy, for example, you have a lot of you know, cultural projects which bring together activists, cultural workers, migrants, and families, homeless families, which have mobilized to take over spaces that have been, or the state wanted to privatize, and they have started to mobilize and create alternative forms of you know, a counter state, if you wish. I'm using the terms of a scholar that I use a lot, Davina Cooper. And so I really felt that you could compare actually a state like a non-state like Palestine with a state like, or like growingly non-state or like crumbling state like Italy, and the ways in which different sort of organization, by collaborating and particularly by working with sort of cultural forms, are creating these new institutional spaces. I just make an example to just make very clear what I mean. In Rome, the third largest collection of contemporary art, so if you wish, a museum of contemporary art, and a pretty big one, has been created in a squatted place, and has been created to protect the 200 people who live there from eviction by the police. And that place is called the Museum of the Other and the Elsewhere. And that place has become a very interesting place for thinking about also the meanings of our heritage institutions and our cultural institutions.
Right. No, thank you so much. And I've just been thinking about things like as you've been talking, and like also just the idea, and this is just a comment, I'll pass on the mic to Shindana. I think we're almost at time, is also like how is it that neoliberal practices allow us to maybe also look at what does statehood look like, because we see just such not just fragmented form. The idea of comparison, when you were talking about the research grant, is at how states see themselves and how aghast they are if fingers are pointed at them or any kind of comparison is made between, between them and something that they don't consider to be an ideal form of statehood or their own politics of recognition. And the fact that you call the Italian state like a crumbling state. Also, I mean, again, if one digs deeper and sees really what ideas of statehood are or what should be or could be, and how states see themselves, I can imagine like they don't see themselves as a crumbling state at all, but rather like a very robust idea which is built upon historical legacies as well. But but thank you so much for this conversation. It's given me, and I'm sure like a lot of us, so many things to think with. With that, yeah.
Can I ask you something, because I would be really interested in hearing more about sort of the relationship between heritage and the state in a place like India and indeed Pakistan, because I mean, in Palestine, there is a little bit of a different debate. And well, actually, it's a similar one. But in Italy, for example, in the last few years, there has been a raging debate between sort of the defenders of the state and the champions of the state, so to speak, and the champions of neoliberal reform, and a view of civil society that was very, very problematic. And I really felt very unsatisfied with the framing of the debate. So you had, let's say, the left wing supporting the old state infrastructure for cultural and heritage management. There was a specific debate related to heritage management. And there were the people that I liked very much, but who took up, in a way, a very conservative position of defense of the old infrastructure of the state, which, nota bene, in Italy has fascist origin, because the current, infrastructure goes back to the fascist period with the Legge Gentile, so a law that was, promulgated by the fascists. So, but they were defending the state and arguing against the dismantling of the state, against the sort of the neoliberal faction, which was for let's sort of the private sector and civil society take care of heritage with the classic rhetoric. The state is oppressive, and the private sector, private bodies and private agencies and civil society do things much better. And in fact, I thought it was a very, very problematic Manichaean way of viewing and of debating the kind of transformation that cultural management is going through today. And I don't know, I would be interested in knowing what's the debate in, for example, or what are the sort of the developments in a place like India or Pakistan.
Right. I mean, briefly, I guess there's so much. So maybe I guess like one of the main things that comes to mind is just how, especially in India is right now under a right-wing Hindu nationalist government, and it's been for some years, and how heritage has kind of been on its radars in different ways in terms of them combining it with the rhetoric of course, urban development, about putting India on the map as, you know, a country of world-class cities, also very urban-based narrative that's been pushed across, and how that kind of interplays with the government's own rather building heritage, and also like creating symbols that are heritage representative, but are very specific to the kind of specific pasts that the government wants to, or the state wants to highlight, which would be in the form of statues, which would be in the form of temple-based narratives, protection of certain religious heritage structures as desirable heritage versus others. And I mean, recently the debates that have been going on in the capital city of Delhi, the capital of India, has been just the state building up certain buildings, a very Pentagon sort of project akin to the US building. Like it's a Central Vista project, which is happening again in a very heritage zone, but that heritage is deriving more from a colonial past as opposed to, let's say, a quote unquote Muslim past, or even before like an ancient Indian, aka a Hindu past. So I mean, there's a lot, and I would both Nana and I would love to talk to you and continue this conversation further, and talk about our respective contexts and how that relates to your extensive work, because we also read a lot of your work and use it for our own. But yeah, so with that, Chandana, if you would just want to make some closing comments, and we can maybe bring this
yeah, up. I think I really appreciate you encouraging everyone to like make these comparisons and not look at the cases in isolation, which helps put a lot of things in perspective, but also I think starts the conversations which are very important across the globes and need to happen in order to work against the ideas, as you mentioned, of Eurocentrism, or a very particular kind of modernity which is being replicated in all parts of the world. And debunking those centralized ideas is very important in the kind of works we all do. Again, I would also love to follow up on the conversation. I still have a lot of questions to ask. It was a very insightful conversation, and I'm pretty sure like our audience also was hugely benefited from your answers and comments. And thank you so much once again for joining us today. We will definitely be in touch on email to follow up on certain thoughts that emerged out of this conversation. I'm really happy that you were able to join us today and were able to take out time from your very busy schedule. And hopefully when things are fine, we can have you at Stanford in person.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you for the lovely invitation. And really, I'm always happy to be at Stanford, however this happens. And thank you so much for the lovely invitation. Hope to see you soon. Or maybe I cannot, unfortunately, invite you to Amsterdam at the moment, but if you happen to pass by and to stop in Amsterdam, please let me know. So I'll make sure to organize a dialogue, a conversation with the people with whom I'm working.